Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In last week's video, we were on the Little Mashel River right at the base of Mount Rainier National Park, and we were after two things: waterfalls and fall colors. And I gotta say, I think we ticked both of those boxes with the photos that we came away with. Now, I actually haven't edited any of the photos from that trip. That's how this channel works. I have two of them set up right here in Adobe Lightroom, and we're gonna edit these from start to finish together. I want to hear down in the comments your feedback. If you like how I'm editing these photos, if you have other ways that you've edited them, or if you just like the photo overall. That's how these videos work. It's a collaborative editing process, and who knows, maybe in the future we'll even do these videos live, so it really can be truly collaborative. All that said, I've got the first photo pulled up. I am really excited to edit it, and we're going to get started. For our very first image, we have this scene right here. This was basically our first solid image of the day. We've got some beautiful green ferns over on the right-hand side, some gold and yellow leaves, my personal favorite part of this image, down here on these mossy rocks. We've got a double waterfall, a smaller, more traditional curtain-style waterfall in the background, and then this longer sheeting waterfall towards the middle of the image, and we have some more kind of golden leaves in the background. Now I see a few things, a few pitfalls with this image. First, the background is a little bit busy, so we're going to try and darken that area and push the viewer's vision more towards the center of the frame and these leaves in the lower right. I think I'm going to end up trying to desaturate some of the rocks so that way the green stands out a bit more. I would like to push the leaves to be a little bit more of a orange color maybe, and I want that because I actually want to push the greens a little bit more towards blue. So I've got a really nice blue-orange contrast in this image. And while it's not overexposed, you can see our histogram over here in the top right, the waterfall here in the center of the frame was fully exposed to the sky above and the intense light coming and hitting it, and so it is really bright. So we're gonna have to darken that just a bit. So to get started with this edit, I think the first thing I'm going to do is drop our white balance just a bit from 5350 down to, let's say 4800 or thereabouts. That's a good start. It's also helping push some of those greens more into a cooler temperature like what we talked about. We definitely need to come over here and drop our highlights a bit. We'll recover some of them a little bit later. I'm going to try and give this image a bit more of a low contrast look. So we're going to boost our shadows. We'll also boost our blacks, and we'll be a little bit more selective later on with areas that we darken. And then our whites we will drop as well, but not as much as our highlights. There's no need to make this a flat image. Down here, we'll leave the dehaze and clarity for now and texture, things like that. We can always do those later on, but all of those are going to actually affect the color of the image. And so I really like to work on the color first before we come in and try and work with any of those. The vibrance in the image, we can increase just a little bit, but again, I think we're going to end up working on this a little bit through a different method, maybe through some color grading or adjusting our HSL sliders. But I think we'll increase the vibrance and just desaturate just a little tiny bit. I do want to add a little bit of vignette. I normally would add a vignette closer towards the end of an edit, but I just know that I'm going to want to pull the viewer's attention more towards the center of the frame. So we'll go with a -12, something like that, just to get started. I think at this point, we're going to just get straight into our color curves. So we could do color grading right here on the color grading panel, or for today, I think what we'll do for starters is actually go directly to our color curves. So over here on the red channel, I'm gonna make a point right here in the middle, down here in our shadows, and up here in our mids. And I think what we'll end up doing is we're gonna introduce a little bit more teal and blue, or teal, more cyan, I think technically is the name, into our shadows, a little bit more red in our highlights. And really where you're gonna see that happening is that's gonna bring some reds into the leaves. We'll fix the water in a minute. It is gonna come out of this with a bit of a color cast, but we'll desaturate it. And it's gonna give me a little bit more blue in our greens. You can already see that happening over here on the right. For our greens, we'll see. I think for now, we'll try and do something similar. I might back off of the greens in a little bit, but what we are seeing is a little bit more of a push towards magenta here on the rocks. Right now, these rocks over here are way too blue. We'll deal with that again in a minute. These are almost global edits that we're making at the moment. And then over here in our blue channel, so you can see that this is making pretty much the only part of the image this is affecting is maybe a tiny bit on the leaves, but predominantly here in the water. We certainly don't want yellow water, so I think we'll give it a little bit of a blue. Again, I'm probably going to desaturate that water. So if I push this slider too far south, the entire image just becomes way too yellowy, and maybe in some settings with more red leaves, things like that, like maples, that would look better. But I think we're going to leave this just barely adding a tiny bit of yellow. And once we deal with some of our other colors, I think that'll actually work out quite nicely. So the water actually came out with not too much of a color cast. That's great. And maybe if we come down here, we're going to first start with some saturation. And we'll come in here and maybe let's start with the fern. I know that I want my greens to be more green. And what I know is that I would like them to have a bit more of a hue, more leaning into a bluish green than a yellowish green. And so right now I'm using the color picker, which is this little tool right here. And I'm just selecting over here and you can see the slider moving. And as I go this way, it gets more yellowy orange. As I go this way, the green gets more blue. So just a little bit. That's almost too much. We'll do like a +4, +5, something like that. Not very much. The yellows we can deal with in just a minute. I do want our blues to be a little bit more on the blue side than green, and the same down here. Sorry, our aquas and blues. And our reds, let's see. As I swing this really to the extremes, there's not very much happening in the image, so I think I'll leave my reds. Oranges is going to make a huge difference in this image. That is all of these darker leaves down here on the rocks. And so I do want them to be orange. I don't want them to be this red, right? So we're going to introduce just a little bit of red to them, maybe a -10 or thereabouts. Let's see. Yeah, let's not go too far. Let's stick with like a -10, -11, try and be fairly conservative there. Going back to our saturation, we can adjust the saturation for our oranges. I do want those leaves to be a bit more orange than they are, so we'll go with a +12. For some of our greens, if I really drag out the saturation this way, they get way, way too oversaturated. Honestly, I think I'm going to desaturate them just slightly. We have a little bit of blue tones and aqua tones in this image, but overall, I think they're pretty good. Maybe I'll desaturate them just slightly. I really don't want these rocks over here in the channel to be blue, and I don't want the water to have a blue tinge to it either. Maybe ever so slightly, but nowhere to where you would look at it and actually think that it looks blue. So luminance is the very next thing that we're going to work on. And I think for this, we will go back to using the color picker. So over here, selecting my leaves, I want these leaves to be nice and bright against the rocks. And if I come over here and select the rocks themselves, let's see what happens. Yeah, those are all being affected at the same time. So we'll do a mask to get what we want out of that. Our greens, I do want them to stand out a little tiny bit. So we'll have a little bit of added luminance to our greens. We're going to drop our blues and drop our aquas for sure. So already, if we see the before and the after, there's a lot more character to this image, a lot more color contrast in this image. And in some ways, I'm like, okay, this already looks pretty good, but I think we'll start back here and actually adjust our tone curve, because this is going to introduce contrast. It's going to accentuate some of that color contrast, and maybe we'll bring it back up to the dehaze tool, things like that in a minute. I think we're going to end up doing some masking and definitely a linear gradient to try and draw our eye more towards the lower right corner of the frame and away from some of the busyness that's going on up in the upper left. So let's see, if I raise my darks just a little bit, I don't want the image to be flat, but I do want it to be soft. And then I drop my shadows. Let's see what that does. Not bad. That's a pretty extreme adjustment. So maybe we'll go with a -15. And let's see, as I adjust my darks, obviously if I drop them, super contrasty image. For some people, that might be what you're going after, but to my eyes, that has just blown the saturation of this image out of the water. And yes, the leaves really stand out, but not in the way that I want. So I'm going to increase our darks just a bit, try and flatten out the image a little bit while still letting the shadows be dark in the darkest parts of the image. Up here for lights, let's see, again, just swing it around. If you crank this too much, what you can see is happening is these leaves over here are all becoming a bit too bright. We don't want it that bright, but if I keep it flat or even in the minus, let's see. Actually, as I say that, yeah, maybe we'll do just a barely any adjustment, like a +5. I actually really like what it looks like if I draw those down a little bit. Again, I'm going for kind of a flat look to this image, but I think keeping it where it is, maybe a +5, +7, I think it has just enough contrast. And with some masking and selective adjustments, I can still get the look that I'm going for. And then our highlights here, I do want to increase the highlights generally across the entire image. But there's a difference here. I'm not going to crank on it, and I'm actually going to go in here and manually mask this water and drop it a bit, because I think there's a lot of texture in this waterfall right here going through the center of the image that we're not actually capturing right now. So why don't we do that next? We'll come up here to our mask. For now, why don't we do a brush? And you've been watching this channel. If you haven't, this might be news to you. It might even seem odd, but my personal preference is to come in there and use the tool without auto masking for putting the brush down. And then what I like to do is go into erase right over here, select auto mask, and then usually adjust my flow back to about 80% or so, and then use the auto mask to do a better job of kind of cleaning up the edges. Sometimes just because I find that the auto mask sometimes can be almost too specific in what it's highlighting, and not so much that this is quicker. I'm pretty sure it isn't actually, but this is just the way that I prefer to do it. So maybe give it a shot yourself and see if you get better results doing this with your photos. You might not. Right now, as I'm scrolling through here, I'm just cleaning up the edges. All I want to select right now is the main section of this waterfall coming through the image. It doesn't have to be perfect, because what we're going to do here really is only going to affect the brightest parts of this waterfall. And you'll notice that I don't have any of this brush affecting this waterfall in the back. If I want to treat that waterfall, I'm going to do it separately, because really the exposure of that waterfall is just so different from the one going through the middle of the frame. So right now, let's see, scroll down right here and make sure I've got my mask selected. If I decrease the exposure on this, yeah, you can see there's a lot of texture and detail coming back. I don't think we need to drop it that far, but maybe something like 1/3 of a stop. Maybe, yeah, let's see 1/3 of a stop with some highlights being drugged down. There we go. So we'll do about -20 on the highlights, and then 1/3, just over 1/3 of a stop in terms of exposure reduction. I'll drop my shadows just a bit. Since I have the waterfall selected, really what's going to happen when I drop my shadows is it's just going to affect, if you can see my cursor, these areas right here, where you have texture in areas where the flow of the water was broken up, and you can just see through it a little bit to the dark rocks on the other side. Same with dropping my blacks. And we can actually introduce or raise our whites just a little bit, not to counteract what we did with the highlights, but again, just to add a little bit more contrast within the waterfall itself. So I think maybe, yeah, maybe a +15, +13, something in that realm. I personally, when I'm editing photos like this, long exposures of waterfalls, sometimes you get a color cast either through the edit process or through the capture process on the waterfall itself. I like to make sure that that water is either a neutral, relatively desaturated, I don't mean black or white, just slightly desaturated, or I like to introduce a little bit of blue by reducing my white balance just for that waterfall. And so right now, we're going to swing this and see what it looks like. This is what I would say is too cold. So introducing way too much blue into the water. But let's go back to where it is right now. As we did our color adjustments earlier, we already saw it's relatively neutral. If you bring it up and warm it up too much, then it just looks like muddy, kind of gross water, if I'm being honest. So we'll just introduce the tiniest bit of blue, maybe about a -5. That tells you visually in your brain that this is cold water. It looks blue, but the water itself is not overly blue. And even as I look at this, 5 may be too much. We might come back and adjust this. I don't typically do any sort of tint adjustments on the water unless it really needs it, or unless I'm getting a color cast from whatever ND filter I might be using. almost all ND filters introduce some kind of color cast, and so you're going to probably want to do a tint adjustment either globally or in certain areas, but in this image, I think it's okay. And saturation, I do often like to desaturate the water a little bit, and so we'll just bring that down just slightly, maybe about a -10 or so. So it still has a ever so slight blue tinge in some areas, especially like up here, but down here, we're making sure that we don't have any really strong yellow tones or green tones or things like that. We're going to come over here and we're going to pick a second brush. This is an entirely new mask that we're creating, and we're going to zoom in right over here on the second cascade. And as I scroll back up, I'm going to come through and just select it like that. That is obviously a very messy mask, but we're going to clean it up with our eraser tool. And really all I want here is just a selection of some of the bright little ribbons of water working their way through the image. There we go. It doesn't have to be perfect. You'll see what we're about to do is really only going to affect the brightest sections of this mask. So if your mask bleeds into, or your brush bleeds a little bit into these darker areas, that's completely okay. Okay, come up here, make sure I've got the correct mask selected. I'm always really paranoid about that. I've adjusted the wrong mask in the past. So as we come down here, I'm going to increase the exposure about 1/3 of a stop, and we're going to see what happens if we just push our highlights ever so slightly. This cascade in the back was pushed way against the other side of the river, and so what that means is it actually was right up against the bank and covered and didn't receive as much light as the one in the middle. And I don't want it to be lost in the background of the image. I want it to not be as prominent as the front one, but still something that your eye gets drawn to. There we go. So a little bit of whites added, a little bit of blacks, and this one really has no color cast associated with it, so I feel pretty good about that. So going back so we can see the entire image, that looks pretty good to me. There we go, exit all of our masks. Let's just check and do a quick before and after. This was before, and this is after. As I do that, of course, it's going to look real dramatic, the change that's happened to the water, but I think overall it fits the image, and no longer is that waterfall, the sheeting waterfall in the middle, just sucking your eyes in because it's the brightest thing in the image. Instead, it's really these leaves on this bank over here on the right-hand side that are now the brightest part of the image. As we come over here, let's try. This may or may not work, especially with the kind of muddiness of the rock color here, but let's try and do a color selection on these rocks, because I would actually really like to desaturate them and darken them just a bit. But you can see with this color range mask that we are also actually grabbing a lot of the yellow in these leaves. So if I come over here, we can do this two ways. We could directly adjust the color range. Why don't we do that first, just so you can see what's going on. If I select color range, you can have the refine slider and I can drag it down. Let's see, that's actually looking pretty good, not too bad. I definitely don't want to select any of the water for what I'm about to do, or any of the leaves. And so by dragging the refine down, we're now much more in the correct color range. We're not going to affect very many of these leaves, but as you can see, we are going to affect all of these trees. That's fine, they can be darkened, that's what we're about to do, but I do not want any of this water selected. So to fix that, we're going to go to subtract, and we're going to pick luminance range. And we already know that this water is quite bright, so let's select that and see how good of a job that does at cleaning up our selection. It's close, but honestly, some of this that's happening down here, we still are hitting some of the water on the edges here. I'm not sure that that's what I want to do, that luminance range adjustment. I think we're going to delete that sub mask and just stick with the color range, and instead we're going to subtract everything else with something like a brush or with a linear gradient. And so that way you don't have to watch me brush everything out. We're going to stick with a linear gradient for starters. I'm going to keep it pretty short, meaning it's going to be an abrupt linear gradient, and I'm going to push it over this way. And as I push it to the right, you can see that now our color range mask is no longer affecting anything on the other side of the bank. And I just want to push it enough, maybe rotate it a smidge. Just want to push it enough that all we're really doing is affecting this kind of right-hand side of the image, not very much down here. And I think that's pretty good. There are a couple areas right down here. I'm pointing at my screen. You can't see that. There are a couple areas right down here where we're still affecting some of the rocks and a tiny bit of the water. But overall, I think this looks pretty good. So we'll go back, make sure we have that mask selected. And now let's see. If I desaturate this, if I darken the shadows, or if I drop the exposure a little bit, then it's going to help reduce some of the reflections that are on those rocks. I think I was already using a polarizing filter for this image. Let's see if we just drop our blacks. Just a bit, drop our shadows. We can desaturate those rocks ever so slightly. And I think we are going to need to do a reduction in exposure. There we go. About 1/5 of a stop really helped that pop quite a bit. So if I come up here and I turn this mask layer on and off, keep an eye on the rocks right over here and the contrast of the leaves against those rocks, and also the contrast of the green of the moss against those rocks. So it is on right now. The mask is off. The mask is on. The mask is off. The mask is on. So huge difference of contrast between the leaves and the surface of those rocks. I'm really happy with that. Now, right now, the left-hand like upper third, kind of, yeah, roughly, of this image is darker than all the rest. That might be okay. It doesn't look bad. I think some of the color up here could actually be brightened, some of these golds and these leaves up here. But I also don't want it to draw our eye away from the main subject, which is these leaves and secondary, the waterfall itself. So let's see what happens if we come up here with maybe a, maybe for simplicity, again, we'll start with a linear gradient. You could come in here with a brush and really just mask the bejesus out of this thing, but I'm not sure that that's necessary to get what I'm looking for. And I just want to experiment really quick. What happens when I increase the exposure or when I decrease the exposure? You can play with images when you're editing them. You don't have to have a vision in mind all the time. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you know what that photo should look like when you capture it. Other times it's a bit more of a work in progress. So as I increase right now, this is about 1/2 a stop right here. And overall, the image gets a bit busier when I've done that, but it also has done a great job of brightening some of the golds right here in this tree. So I think what we can do is clean up this linear gradient a little bit with a brush to mostly affect the leaves on this tree, maybe a little bit of these rocky areas, keeping those nice and dark. I definitely want to increase the whites on that tree just a bit and drop our blacks. I want color contrast. And let's see, if I adjust my white balance here, yeah, I can introduce a little bit more warm tones into those leaves on the opposite side of the bank, so that way they don't get lost against what is really, frankly, a busy background behind what I thought was a tree and ended up being a bush. So that looks pretty good. I'm not going to adjust the saturation. You can already see we have some very saturated greens happening on the other side of this bank. Maybe we'll deal with those in a minute. And let's clean up this guy just a little bit. So I have a brush and I'm going to see what happens. Let's turn on auto mask and bring us again back down to about 80. I just want to see what happens as I come in here and try to just clean this up. Now, you could just go in and originally drop a mask in here with a brush tool and just select this area. I really wanted to see what would happen if I was affecting the entire left side of the bank. And what I learned, as you kind of just saw a minute ago, was I don't like what it's doing to these rocks. It's drawing your attention way too much. But I do want this bush, I won't even call it a tree, on the other side to have some really nice contrast against an otherwise dark background. So relatively small mask now. There's a little bit down here in the corner that needs to be cleaned up, and a little bit over here. There we go. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe a bit too much here along the edge. Let's see what happens. Actually, let me reduce the flow to about 50% and just reduce some of that so our corner stays dark and we don't have too much contrast leading our eyes up into the corner of the image. I think that's pretty good. I'm happy with that. The last thing that I'm seeing here, our rocks are still a little bit blue. right here in the middle of the image. I want to clean that up just a little bit. And I think what I want to do is add a little bit of a linear gradient here at the bottom, again, to push your eyes upwards into the frame, and maybe something up here, because the brightest part of the image is basically right over here, this far bank, and that is not where I want your eyes to go. I may also, we'll see, brighten this water just a little bit. I may have been a bit heavy-handed with my exposure reductions on it. So self-editing, I think, is a really valuable skill to work on, and it takes time, both for you to look at an image and get familiar with what you think it should look like, and for you to be willing to walk back your own edits. Yeah, it can take time to learn that skill. I am still learning it. Yeah, okay, that looks much better with the introduction of this linear gradient. It really is just bringing our eyes up to these leaves right here. I'm going to add a little bit of rotation to it, so that way the bright water doesn't carry your eyes out of the image. And we'll work with one more linear gradient. We could also do a radial brush for this, but I think a linear gradient would actually work out just fine. I want it to be pretty gradual. Actually, you know what? I think we will go with a radial brush. You can see how that linear gradient was going to affect the tree that we just worked on. Kind of counterproductive. So let's go with a radial gradient and stick them right up here. Rotate just a little bit. I'm okay if it bleeds into this upper corner. I just barely want it. That's actually squished a little bit more oval. Draw it down this way. Yeah, something like that. There we go. I don't want this radial brush or gradient to be affecting these leaves right here, but I do want it to keep your eye from getting sucked up into that bright upper right corner of the image. So let's see, we're probably talking a fairly minor exposure adjustment here. Yeah, about 0.2, 0.15 of a stop. We'll drop our shadows just a little bit, probably drop our highlights since we have some sky showing up there. And if we drop our whites, that's going to do quite a lot for keeping your eye from going up there. So we'll do about a -5. And yeah, about a -5 pretty much all the way through, except for highlights, which we did a little bit more, mostly because we have some exposed sky coming in. And well, that sky is very, very bright. So as a whole, I think this looks pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy with it. It's got good color. The white balance feels pretty spot on. But as I said, I think maybe I was a little heavy-handed with my exposure adjustments and maybe white balance adjustments on the water in the middle. So revisiting that, I'm going to see what happens if I just adjust my exposure upwards on the water. Again, there's texture here that we lose if we go too high, but I think something like that. We went from about 1/3 of a stop to about 0.15 of a stop. So, or let's go back to 0.15. There we go. Yeah, I think that's much better. It's bright, but it's not the brightest part of the image for sure. That still belongs to these beautiful leaves down here. The very last thing that we might consider here is if we need to adjust our crop. I could imagine doing this in something like a 16:9 or just cropping this up a little bit so we get rid of this distracting leaf down here on the bottom. So something like that has done an okay job. We still have some distracting dead pieces of grass over here on the right-hand side. And honestly, we've got this sky up at the top that I'm not a huge fan of. So I'm actually quite curious. Let's go over here in our aspect and see what a 16:9 looks like. And I'm going to bring this full width again. Let's see. Ooh, yeah, I'm a fan of that. Now that we've cropped this image as a 16:9, it really completely changed the image. I think it really elongated that waterfall in the middle of the image and made it almost feel taller. The leaves along the bottom that were distracting me are not there anymore. Maybe I'll come in later and clone out these little pieces of dead grass in the lower right. I think they're a little distracting, but that is usually a last resort for me. And of course, we don't have that bright section of sky up here in the upper right that was drawing my eye away pretty much no matter what I did in terms of dropping its highlights. So overall, really happy with this image. Let's move on to image number 2. As we move into our second photo of this video, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed that first photo, and maybe leave some comments down below on what you thought or what you would do differently. Now, for our second photo, there's something to consider here, which is whether or not we want this photo to have a similar tone or similar appearance to our first photo. Sometimes you really want consistency across your images, but I think for this, I want this image to be a little bit warmer, at least because we have so little fall color in this image compared to the last that I really feel like we need to lean into it a bit more, and maybe we'll have to kind of bring some of the yellow tones back in the rocky areas, things like that. When I look at the photo right now, there are two things that immediately stick out to me as things that we need to fix. The first is we're gonna have to crop this image. That's just my opinion. I have way too much sky up here in the top, and down here around the waterfall, it is blown. If you look at my histogram, it is just off the charts over here. There are some areas of the waterfall that are fully blown out. There's no detail remaining in those areas. So, very first thing, let's just try a basic crop, because how we deal with the rest of the image, sometimes on that last image we cropped at the end, it was a bit of an afterthought, but it really benefited the image. Sometimes if I know I'm gonna have to do a crop, I'll do it up front because it changes the overall composition and it changes how you want to weight your attention on different elements of the photo. So as I bring this down just a little bit, obviously we don't want to chop off the tops of these trees up here, but we want as little of that sky as possible. If you were so inclined, and I am not, you could use something like a generative fill in Photoshop to actually just completely remove the sky. I'm not talking about a sky replacement, I'm talking about making it look like there were trees in the background there. We're not going to do that right now. We'll live with, whatever is left in terms of the sky that we need to include in the photo. We do have to watch the right-hand side over here. If we crop too small or shift too far to the left, we lose part of this tree, and I do want to keep that there. And it looks like that might be okay. I don't know. This is really tricky. If I bring this too far south, we clip the top of that tree off, which I know I don't want to do. And the top of the waterfall is at the same height as that tree. So if we want to give the waterfall enough space and not have it feel cramped up against the top of the frame, we're kind of stuck with including a lot of that sky. And down here at the bottom of the frame, there are some little details down here that you might think are distracting. I personally think I'm going to clip them out or crop them out, which are these little bits down here of the water, these tiny little waterfalls. So maybe we'll try something like this. We can always go back and adjust the crop later if necessary. I don't want this waterfall to feel super, super cramped. So for all that I want to do about removing the sky up there with a crop, there's not really much to do, and sometimes that's just how it works out. Let's look at white balance. I know that I want this image in particular to be a bit warmer than the last, so I'm going to bring this from about 5300 up to about 5800. This is way, way too warm for the rest of the image. I'm really just looking at the yellows that we have up in the tree and the overall feeling of the image. We're going to be selective with some adjustments later on, both in the water and on these rocks, to bring some blue tones back into the image, maybe through the color picker, like what we did in the last image, or maybe through a color grade. We'll see when we get there. The next thing we have to deal with on this photo is the waterfall. We know that it's overexposed. So let's do a basic brush, and let's just come in here and select everything in this area, and we'll clean it up in just a second. There we go. Really coarse brush. That's just how I like to do it. And now we'll go through and clean it up just a bit. I'm not going to be too picky about how accurate this brush is right now, mostly because, yes, I want to affect the highlights, but I also want to include some of the darker areas within the waterfall itself that are kind of interstitial with those bright white areas, because I'm going to end up probably reintroducing some whites and dragging our shadows and our blacks down a little bit to really add some texture to the waterfall itself. So up here, get rid of this little section. That looks pretty good. We can clean it up a little bit if necessary in a minute, but let's see where we get with this brush first. So coming over here, let's drop our exposure about 1/5 of a stop. Looks pretty good. Highlights, we don't want to go too far because then it turns gray like what you see right now. That's not really what I'm going for. That could play well if you were going for an overall very soft image, but let's go with maybe something like a -13, or maybe even a -10 is enough. Yeah, minus 11, pretty close. Our shadows, like I said, we're going to drop. We're going to also drop our blacks. You can see that that actually made quite a big difference for some of these interstitial areas right here. There's a lot more texture coming out. And we're going to take our whites and boost them just a bit. We want the waterfall to look bright. We just don't want it to look blown out. There we go. Okay, 13, 15, 10, somewhere in that range. We're going to take our white balance and definitely drop it a bit here, maybe a minus 9 for now. Borderline too blue or too cool, but we can always come back and fix that later on. And as you've seen in the past, I'm going to desaturate just a bit, but not too much, because our brush does encompass some of the green moss that's on the rocks behind the waterfall. Down here, we will check out the dehaze and see what happens. Yeah, I think that's doing a lot for us. So we'll dehaze pretty strongly, about a 15 or so, and that's bringing a lot more clarity to some areas right here where we had mist falling through the water. And yeah, it's just letting us see through it a little bit more and making the individual little mini cascades or curtains of water that are falling a lot more clear and almost segmented, so that way they stand out from each other a bit more. And let's see, I don't think we're going to add very much clarity, maybe just a smidge, like a +9 or +10. And texture, maybe like a +5, something like that. So you can see right now, let me come back and turn this brush on and off. So right now, this brush or the mask is turned on. You can see we have really good texture in some areas of the waterfall, like here and over here. And if I come up here and I turn it off, you can see generally it's just a lot more flat. There's a lot less going on, but turn back on, it looks pretty good. Obviously, it looks quite cool right now. So we're going to have to play with that as we deal with the color balance in the rest of the photo. Back to a fitted view, looks pretty good. As we know, the rest of the image is a bit too warm. So let's see if we can fix that. Why don't we try a color grade for starters? Let's come over here and introduce a bit more blue into our shadows. And what I'm looking at are the complementary colors on these wheels. So we've got our blues over here, and then we have our yellows and our reds over here. I know that I'm probably going to try and introduce a bit more yellow and orange into our mids, maybe our highlights, or one of the two. And that means that I'm going to want to introduce some complementary colors like a blue more into our shadows. And that's going to help with all of these rocks along the bottom of the image. So one thing in Lightroom, I really dislike just floating my cursor when I'm doing color grading like this. What I like to do is to grab the little circle on the outside of this wheel, get it into the area that I think I want to be in, and then come back to this inner circle that I'm selecting, hold down Shift, and when you click on it, this little line appears. And that allows you to do a really smooth linear adjustment where you can really focus, like you've already dialed in the color that you want. Now you're dealing with how much of it you want. And I know that I'm going to want to be pretty conservative here. Just looking at our rocks, you can really see if I drag it, you can really see our rocks are turning blue. This is way too much, obviously. But as I bring it back, something like that is looking pretty good. That has really changed these rocks. And if I turn it on and off, you can see how much that is changing the look of these rocks down along the bottom of the image. So on, off, on, off. So let's come up to our mids. And I think I'm going for like a sunset orange here. I really want some warmth brought into the image, and I'm looking at the color that is opposite of the blue that I just added, so that way it's nice and complementary. I'm going to hold down Shift, and let's see what happens. Yeah, that is doing great things for us. We will still have to clean things up a little bit, but looking at the leaves over here, let me swing this way out so you can really see what it's doing. Obviously, it's affecting the rocks. It's obviously affecting the water. That's not what we want, but we'll be able to clean that up just a bit. I'm looking at the trees and the color in the rest of the image. I think something like this, maybe a 15 on the saturation. And the highlights, we'll see. I'm a little bit more skeptical about adjusting these highlights. Obviously, it's affecting the water. We knew that was going to happen. Those are some of the highlights in this image. Yeah, I'm not sure that this is doing too much for us, to be honest. So I think we'll leave it as is, and maybe let's try and move into a mask to treat these rocks specifically, and to deal with some of the moss. But actually, before we go so far as a mask, which is a really detailed process, we have a lot to do up here at the beginning of the image. So we're going to drop our shadows, sorry, drop our highlights. We're going to increase our shadows. We're going to drop our whites, and we are going to raise our blacks. That's going to make this image a bit flatter, not as flat as the last one, although we started out looking for flatness in the last one and ended up somewhere a little bit more contrasty than I originally thought we were going to go. Maybe like a plus 15 on our blacks, something like that. We'll leave the dehaze, clarity, texture, leave those alone for now. And then similar to the last image, we definitely want some vibrancy here. That's going to help our greens. And I'll leave the saturation slider alone for now. Let's do our really basic tone curve here. Make sure that our lights are popping. Bring some of our darks back. Drop our shadows. That is not how a lot of people do it. A lot of people in this image would drop the darks as well. I'll show you what that looks like. Way too dark, way too contrasty. All you really see in this image when you do that are the treetops and the waterfall. That's not really what I'm looking for. So we'll stick with about a plus 20 on the darks, leave the shadows like that. And I think we can actually bring a little bit back to our highlights, not too much. That highlight adjustment is affecting the waterfall, of course, but it's also affecting these treetops. Okay, let's do some point color adjustments over here. First with our greens, let's make sure that these greens are going to look nice and blue and not too yellow. So I'll come over here to the left of the waterfall, nice big patch, easy to select. And when I drag this, it should select green. There we go. Looks like it's dragging the yellow a little bit, which is going to affect some of those leaves up in the trees. But let's see what this looks like. Dragging it a little bit more towards green on the yellows and blue in the greens. That's a bit too broad. So we're just going to affect our greens, push those a little bit blue. I don't think we have much aqua here. Yeah, not at all. Our blue, we have some in the water, but I actually am not that worried about it. I think we'll leave it as is. Probably going to end up desaturating that waterfall a little bit or reducing its white balance more towards blue. It has some magenta in it, so maybe even a tint adjustment. And let's come over to saturation. Same thing. I want to increase the saturation on our greens, but I think I actually want to reduce the luminance of those greens. Now, luminance is separate from saturation. It's separate from hue. It is still part of what defines color, but it's how bright these individual colors appear in the image. So we know, for example, that these treetops are yellow. If I drop their luminance all the way down, you can now see that those yellows are a lot flatter. They're not black, but they are definitely a lot less luminant than they were before. So I'm going to increase our luminance of the yellows. There we go. I really want them to pop. And for our greens, let's see what happens. If I increase it, it's actually adding a little bit of nice texture, helping the greens stand out against the dark rocks, versus if I decrease it, everything does get a little bit flat. I think I'm going to go for that texture. That's actually the opposite of what I thought I was going to do here, but this is a journey and I'm learning as we go. So right now for our blues, same, there's not really too much to do. It is affecting the waterfall a little bit over here, but I don't think that that waterfall needs any help to stand out. So we'll leave the rest of this, maybe our reds. There's not really much red to do in this image besides some of these leaves on the background. So overall, I think that's pretty good in terms of our color picker adjustments. As you can see, pretty minimal. Maybe our yellows, we could push orange a little bit and that'll help with the warmth of the image. Actually, let's see, if I really push our yellows, like a minus 20, that is significant. If I really push our oranges, that is more than I want to do. I don't think that it looks particularly good in the image right now, but I'm curious what happens if I come back up to my white balance and actually cool the overall image back down. So we just went from 5830. Let's see. Yeah, maybe closer to 5200 or so is getting it closer to what we want. Maybe. Let's see. This is 5300. That's 58. Yeah, I think 5300 looks pretty good. The waterfall is looking a little bit cold, so let's just correct that really quick. I can undo the white balance adjustment that I did earlier, and maybe we'll do a -3 instead of something like a -10. And it does need a tiny bit of green to offset the magenta. Maybe even a bit more desaturation could help it. There we go. Looks pretty good on the waterfall. And these trees really have a nice orange tone to them, but it's not overbearing. So it definitely was when we were back up in the 5800 range for our white balance. I'm going to introduce a little bit of vignette that's going to help pull our attention away from the sky up in the top. Again, you could go in and use generative fill or something like that to remove these really distracting sky elements up at the top. That's not my style. I'm not yucking your yum if you want to do that on your own photos. But let's see. I would say that that looks pretty good. The bottom of the image, I would say, is maybe a little bit too dark. We'll deal with that in just a minute. I do want to come in here and try and do maybe a color range selection on these rocks. Let's see what that gets us. Yeah, it's going to select way too much, but let's refine it back. And I don't really want 90% of what's being selected right now. So maybe let's try and do a linear gradient, a very coarse way of cleaning up this mask. Oh, looks like it applied it as an entirely new mask. Let's make sure I've got the right one selected. Go to subtract and then go to linear gradient. There we go. So that's getting a bit closer. We can treat some of the rocks up by the waterfall in a similar way if we need to. And let's just do a quick brush subtraction as well. I'll turn on auto masking for this. We want to make sure that this mask is not going to affect the water itself, because what I'm about to do is desaturate the rocks a little bit and make them appear a little bit darker. And I also want to make sure that this brush is not affecting anything up here. These nice leaves that are up here on the ground, we do not want to desaturate those. Those are bringing really valuable color to this image. So just like this. Doesn't need to be perfect. It rarely is, no matter how hard you try, right? You can see that there's some remnants of the brush living up here, but like we talked about earlier, you rarely want your brush to be just super, super sharp on the edges because it just stands out. Okay, that looks good. Let's make sure we've got that selected. You'll notice it's not picking up on any of the greens in this area, which is good since we're about to desaturate things and I want to keep those greens. But let's see what happens. If I really desaturate the rocks, I'm actually noticing as I do this that it's not quite affecting all the areas I want it to. These rocks up here, I would like to be included. So I'm going to focus right now on these rocks down here, and then we'll modify the brush, clean it up a little bit, and get it to be affecting all the areas that we want. Maybe a -20. That's pretty heavy-handed on the desaturation, but I think between that and a little bit of color temperature adjustment, let's see what this tint will do for us. Introduce a bit of magenta. Not really feeling the magenta. So we'll go with about a +15 on the shadows and about a -15 or -14 on the blacks. We will increase our whites a little bit on these rocks. And if there are any highlights, reflections, we'll bring those in. We want more texture. And we might even apply some dehaze here. Let's see what happens. Yeah, that's helping quite a bit. So they are still too magenta. Let's come up here and look a bit more into our desaturation. I think the number one thing that I'm seeing is it just isn't quite doing what we want. There we go. Bring a bit more green. That looks better. Okay, so let's clean up this brush really quick. I'm going to just do that really quick. I'll speed through it so you don't have to watch me go through and have a fine-tooth comb on this brush. Doesn't make for the best content. So I'll be right back with you in just a minute. We're back. I went in and just cleaned up that brush just a little bit, some adding and subtracting here or there. And overall, I think I'm pretty happy with how those rocks look now. They're really, really nice and dark, but they also have texture and they have really nice color contrast with the green moss sitting on top of them. The only thing that I think is left on this image is maybe a little bit of either some raising of the shadows up here on the left-hand side to bring out some detail in this rock, or a linear gradient to help push the viewer's eye more towards the brighter parts of the image. Because right now the image, I would say it's close to balance, but a slightly out of balance, a little bit too much emphasis on the left-hand side. So let's try for starters to see what a linear gradient would look like if we applied it from left to right. Now, I don't want this gradient to bleed too much into the waterfall, so I'm going to pretty much have it something like that. And also, I will say, let's do a subtraction of another linear gradient. I don't want it affecting the bottom of the image over here, like that. Those rocks on the bottom, we already treated those. I don't want things to be doubling up on them. So make sure we've got our mask selected. There we go. And let's see what happens. If we increase our exposure a little bit, there's actually some good detail in there. It's not so bright that it's distracting, but it definitely was underexposed because it's right up against that bright waterfall. So we could bring back some shadows, drop our blacks a little bit, and that's going to increase some contrast, even though we are actually raising the overall exposure of that area. It definitely needs a little bit of a saturation boost, just a bit. And yeah, I think that actually helps quite a bit. So that is what it would look like if we had our linear gradient. There we go. So that's off, on, off, on. Definitely some nice color in there, some neat little plants up on the side of the waterfall. So I think we will keep it just like this. It actually helps balance out some of the oranges and stuff on the right-hand side of the frame. Now, the waterfall itself, I think there are some areas in here that are a bit too blue, and that can be said for some of the rocks down below, but they are pretty much as desaturated as I'm going to be able to push them. So I'm going to revisit my color grading and see what happens if I just back off of this adjustment just a little bit. Being able to self-edit is a super valuable skill to have. And while I can't do it in a video like this, I would always recommend that you edit a photo and go walk away for 10 minutes and then come back. And chances are you will see things about that photo that you would rather have done differently. As I said, that doesn't really fit the format of these videos. And so I am mentally self-editing as we go. And as you're seeing right now, I'm going to come in and reduce some of the shadows with this color grading, some of the blues that I added to those shadows, because I can see right now that it's just not working in this photo. So I'm going to hold down Shift and let's see as I reduce this, what it does to the image. And actually, I'll exaggerate it again really quickly so you can see the areas that are being affected. Obviously, our rocks, way too blue right now, the water way too blue. But what that means is that no matter how small, as I'm adding blue into the shadows with this color grading tool, it is turning areas like this near the waterfall ever so slightly blue. And in my case, more than I actually want to see. So let's dial this back. This is roughly where we were before, and I would still say that waterfall is too blue. So let's keep dialing it back. It's looking better. Man, we may not need it at all. Let's see. Just barely. I mean, this is a 7 on the saturation slider for those blues in the shadows. So extremely minute. The water has a slight blue tinge to it, but I'm happy with it. And the rocks are not blue or kind of magenta looking anymore. So really happy with that. I'm glad that we went back and adjusted that. Now the image has the warmth that I was looking for. The last thing that I want to try and do on this photo is to try and wrangle some of the bright elements in this upper right-hand corner. I know that I want my nice golden yellow leaves to really stick out and to bring warmth to the photo, but of course the sky is really bright. There might not be too much we can do about that because that is basically these remaining blown highlights on our histogram. But even some of these trees up here, if I can darken these a little bit, make them a little bit richer in their color, I think that'll help the trees stand out and just compete with fewer things, because they're never going to win against that bright sky. So maybe let's try this with a linear gradient to start. This obviously is including as part of the mask our yellow leaves. So let's come in here and let's see what happens if we subtract a color range. I'm going to zoom way in and come up here to our tree. And I really don't want to get any greens in here. We're probably going to have to refine this, but let's see what happens. Okay, it does look like it removed most of the tree. If we refine it either way, yeah, so if I drag the refine all the way down, you can see that a lot of those yellow leaves are now back in. And if I increase it, I think we're going to keep it refined all the way. And let's see what this does. We may still have to clean this up just a little bit. I can come in and do shadow adjustments, dark adjustments, things like that. But I think maybe what we'll start with for the purposes of these trees in the background is let's see what happens if we just dehaze things a little bit. That tends to add contrast and it tends to darken things. So right now, dehaze set at 0. This is what it looks like. Let me turn off the overlay for you. And now as I increase dehaze, you can see that it is making the trees a little bit darker. And it's helping our yellows stand out. So I think we'll add maybe about a 15. That's pretty aggressive on dehazing. And then we'll come back up here and see what we can do about blacks or our shadows. There's not very much shadow to be affected, and I want to be careful because if we do crank our shadows too far down, we end up actually affecting this area up to the top left of the waterfall. You got to keep an eye out when you're working with any sort of large adjustments like a linear gradient. So let's see. Maybe we'll leave shadows as is. What does a general exposure drop look like? Maybe too dark. I think honestly, between the blacks coming down just a little bit and the dehaze, that has done a lot. Let's see, since we do have the sky selected, what a reduction in highlights does for us. So obviously I've dropped them down to -70 right now. The sky has gone flat and gray. That is really visually unappealing. You can see on our histogram that we have no more highlights. Not my boat. So we're gonna just increase this back up. I want to see what like a -10. Yeah, those sky highlights are completely blown. So what that means is that even at something like a -20, you can see that they're starting to turn gray and flat. And maybe some people are into that look. I'm going to have to stick with like a -15, something a bit more conservative like that. So I'm going to take that linear gradient and I just want to trigger it on and off. I want to see how much, if any, it's affecting my nice yellow leaves. And if it is affecting them, then I might have to go in and clean up this brush a little bit. So this is on, off, on, off. Pretty happy with that. It's actually doing a good job also of helping the edges of these trees stand out, again, against that darker background of those conifers. So frankly, as a whole, I think I'm pretty happy with the image. We could look at cropping off a little bit of the bottom here, but this might be a case, this branch right here might actually be worth coming in here with the tool to remove it. And I hate to use generative fill, but man, let me tell you, Lightroom has gotten really good for things like this to quickly remove small parts of an image. Let's see how that looks. As I say that, it doesn't look bad. I might come in here and clean this up, but for now, I think that's okay. That was kind of, to me, the last distracting element of this photo was that very, very bright, rich red colored branch on the bottom part of the image. Overall, I really like this photo, but I'm not sure I can pick a favorite between the two. This one, the waterfall is more compelling, and I really like the warmth. Those two trees are pulling their weight for sure, but it's got that bright spot up in the top right-hand corner. And in the first photo, it really has some beautiful color contrast, but it's a little busy and the waterfall just isn't as compelling, although I do really like that 16:9 crop that we ended up with. but I would love to know what you think. So let me know down in the comments which photo you prefer, if you have any feedback about my own editing process, or just feedback about this format of video. I know these are long, but I think to the right people they appeal, and if you don't want to watch these editing videos, just go watch the video of this hike, because these edited photos are going straight into there right before I publish it. All that said, I really appreciate you being here. I hope you like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.